war is often remembered through dates, maps, and the names of generals. But for the men who fought in it, war was far more personal. It was the sound of metal cutting through the air, the smell of smoke and oil, and the sudden knowledge that survival no longer depended on courage alone. At the beginning of the 20th century, warfare changed forever. For centuries, battles were limited by human endurance, how fast a soldier could reload, how long an army could advance. Then a weapon appeared that ignored those limits entirely. It did not tire. It did not hesitate, and it did not care who stood in front of it. This was not just a new gun. It was a machine designed to kill men faster than they could move. When it entered the battlefield, old tactics collapsed. Mass charges turned into mass graves, and bravery alone could no longer stop death from coming. Among all the inventions of modern war, none transformed the battlefield more brutally than the machine gun. This is the story of how war became industrialized and how men became targets. Before the machine gun came to dominate the battlefield, war was still imagined as something fundamentally human. Soldiers fought face to face. Infantry advanced in lines. Officers believed that discipline, morale, and courage were the decisive factors that determined victory or defeat. For centuries, this belief had shaped military thinking across Europe. Armies marched in formation. Rifles were fired in volleys. Battles were brutal, but they were limited by the physical capabilities of the men fighting them. A soldier could only fire so many rounds before needing to reload. Fatigue slowed advances. Fear eventually broke formations. Even as firearms improved, the rhythm of war remained familiar. One man fired one weapon. One mistake cost one life. Commanders believed that with enough training and resolve, soldiers could overcome almost any obstacle placed in front of them. This mindset survived well into the late 19th century. By the time Europe entered the modern industrial age, its generals were still preparing for wars that resembled the past. Military academies taught offensive spirit above all else. The idea of advancing boldly toward the enemy was considered the key to victory. Defensive warfare was seen as passive, yet while doctrine remained traditional, technology was quietly evolving. The Industrial Revolution changed not only factories and cities, but also the tools of war. Steel production increased. Precision engineering improved. Ammunition became cheaper, more irreliably, and easier to manufacture in vast quantities. What had once been handcrafted weapons were now products of assembly lines. Out of this world of industry came a radical idea. What if one weapon could fire continuously, without pause? What if the limits of human hands could be replaced by mechanical motion? What if killing no longer depended on how fast a soldier could reload, but on how long a machine could keep running? Early attempts at such weapons existed long before the 20th century. In the American Civil War, the Gatling gun demonstrated that multiple barrels and mechanical rotation could unleash devastating firepower. But these weapons were heavy, complex, and often unreliable. Most armies viewed them as curiosities rather than essentials. That changed with one invention. In the 1880s, an American-born inventor named Hiram Maxim introduced a weapon that would permanently alter warfare. His machine gun used recoil energy, the force generated when a bullet was fired, to automatically load the next round. For the first time, a firearm powered itself. With a single operator, Maxim's gun could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. It did not require multiple barrels. It did not rely on manual cranking. As long as ammunition was supplied and the mechanism remained intact, the gun kept firing. Maxim himself understood the implications immediately. He famously remarked that his invention would end war, because no nation could afford the cost in lives. He believed that once governments saw the destruction his gun could cause, they would avoid conflict altogether. History would prove him wrong. European powers quickly recognized the machine gun's potential, but not in the way Maxim imagined. Rather than preventing war, it became a tool of dominance. Colonial armies used machine guns to overwhelm poorly equipped opponents across Africa and Asia. Small forces armed with automatic weapons defeated vastly larger groups who relied on traditional arms. These victories reinforced a dangerous illusion. European generals concluded that machine guns were useful, but only against inferior enemies. They believed that wars between modern nations would still be decided by movement, aggression, and decisive offensives. The machine gun was seen as a support weapon, something to protect flanks or defend positions, not something that would define entire battles. As a result, military doctrine barely changed. Infantry manuals still emphasized attack formations. Cavalry units were still trained to charge. Commanders still believed that determination and speed could overcome firepower. The lessons of colonial warfare were not applied to conflicts between industrialized states. By 1914, Europe stood on the edge of war, armed with weapons its leaders did not fully understand. When the First World War began, millions of soldiers marched toward the front with expectations shaped by outdated ideas. They wore bright uniforms. They carried rifles and bayonets. Many believed the war would be short, decisive, and even glorious. They were about to encounter a battlefield that no longer operated by human rules. Machine guns were deployed in increasing numbers, often positioned to cover open ground and narrow approaches. From fixed emplacements, a handful of gunners could dominate entire sections of terrain. Advancing infantry found themselves exposed in ways no previous generation had experienced. What once required hundreds of soldiers firing together could now be achieved by a few men behind sandbags. When armies clashed in the opening months of the war, the results were catastrophic. Attacks that would have succeeded in earlier conflicts collapsed within minutes. Units were cut down before they could reach enemy lines. Commanders ordered repeated assaults, believing the problem lay in execution rather than technology. Each time, the machine gun delivered the same answer. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had frozen into a vast network of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. This was not a planned strategy. It was a forced adaptation to a weapon that made open movement suicidal. The battlefield had been transformed. War was no longer about maneuver alone. It became a contest of firepower, endurance, and industrial output. Men dug into the earth, not to advance, but to survive. And at the center of this new form of warfare stood the machine gun, relentless, impersonal, and devastatingly efficient. In the next part, we will see how armies attempted to break this deadlock, and how the machine gun continued to shape every decision made at the front. By the winter of 1914, it was clear that the war had entered an unexpected and terrifying phase. The rapid advances predicted by generals on all sides had vanished. In their place stood miles of trenches, barbed wire, and overlapping fields of machine gun fire. The battlefield had hardened into a static line where movement meant death. Yet commanders refused to accept stalemate. Military leaders believed that the deadlock could be broken with enough pressure. If one side attacked with sufficient force, they argued, the enemy line would eventually crack. What they failed to understand was that the machine gun had fundamentally shifted the balance between attack and defense. A single, well-positioned gun could sweep entire approaches with bullets. Barbed wire slowed advancing troops, forcing them to bunch together. Artillery bombardments, intended to clear the way, often only churned the ground into mud while leaving machine gun positions intact. When infantry finally went over the top, they faced an environment designed to expose and destroy them. The results were horrifying. At battles like Neuve-Chapelle, Loos, and later the Somme, soldiers advanced in waves, exactly as doctrine prescribed. Whistles blew, men climbed out of trenches. They walked forward under the belief that discipline and courage would carry them through. Machine guns answered within seconds. Gunners were trained to fire in controlled bursts, sweeping left to right, cutting down entire ranks. Belts of ammunition fed continuously. Barrels overheated but were quickly replaced. For the men advancing across open ground, there was no cover and no warning. Many never saw the enemy who killed them. Casualties mounted at a scale previously unimaginable. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. Entire units were shattered in minutes. Officers who had survived earlier wars struggled to comprehend the destruction unfolding before them. The battlefield no longer rewarded bravery, it punished exposure. Yet the attacks continued. Generals believed that losses, however severe, were the price of victory. Industrial nations, Resenat could replace men as long as factories continued producing weapons and ammunition. The machine gun fit perfectly into this logic. It was efficient, reliable, and devastating. A weapon that matched the industrial scale of the war itself, but its impact went beyond numbers. For the soldiers facing it, the machine gun reshaped the psychology of combat. Fear became constant, and impersonal. Death did not come from a visible opponent, but from an unseen mechanism hidden behind earth and steel. There was no duel, no chance to react. Survival felt arbitrary. This eroded morale in ways commanders struggled to address. Soldiers learned quickly that standing upright was dangerous. Movement drew fire. Silence became survival. Trenches grew deeper. Dugouts expanded. Men lived underground for weeks, emerging only at night or under heavy artillery cover. The battlefield became a place where stillness mattered more than aggression. In response, armies searched desperately for solutions. Artillery barrages grew longer and more intense, designed to destroy machine gun nests before infantry advanced. New tactics, like the creeping barrage, attempted to place a moving wall of explosions just ahead of attacking troops. Engineers developed portable shields, explosive charges, and specialized assault units, but the machine gun adapted as well. Guns were moved into concrete bunkers. Firing positions were camouflaged and relocated frequently. Defensive networks overlapped so that even if one gun was destroyed, others could cover the same ground. The battlefield became a web of interlocking fire zones, carefully measured and rehearsed. Every innovation met resistance from steel and bullets. By 1917, it was clear that traditional infantry assaults alone could not defeat the machine gun. The cost was simply too high. New technologies were introduced to restore mobility to the battlefield. Tanks rolled forward, designed to crush wire and absorb fire. Aircraft scouted enemy positions and strafed trenches. Chemical weapons were deployed in an attempt to flush defenders from cover. Yet even as war evolved, the machine gun remained central. Mounted on tanks, aircraft, and defensive positions, it continued to define combat. It was no longer just a defensive weapon. It became a tool of suppression, area control, and psychological dominance. Wherever it appeared, soldiers adjusted their behavior around it. The machine gun taught armies a brutal lesson. Modern war was no longer about individual valor. It was about systems, weapons, supply chains, logistics, and coordination. Men became components within a larger mechanism, valued for their ability to hold positions or advance under orders, regardless of personal risk. For many soldiers, this realization was devastating. Letters from the front reveal a growing sense of helplessness. Men wrote of feeling hunted, pinned down by forces they could not see or fight directly. Courage still mattered, but it was no longer enough. Survival depended on luck, timing, and the effectiveness of machines beyond one's control. By the final years of the war, commanders slowly began to understand what the battlefield was telling them. Combined arms tactics emerged, integrating infantry, artillery, tanks, and air support into coordinated operations. Attacks became more flexible, relying on infiltration and surprise rather than massed waves. These changes finally began to reduce the machine gun's dominance, but never eliminate it. When the war ended in 1918, millions were dead. Entire regions were destroyed, and the machine gun stood as one of the clearest symbols of how industrial technology had transformed human conflict. It had not ended war, as its inventor once hoped. It had reshaped it. In the final part, we will examine the legacy of the machine gun, how its lessons carried into future wars, how it influenced military doctrine worldwide, and why its shadow still hangs over modern battlefields today. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world emerged from the First World War fundamentally altered. Empires had collapsed, borders had been redrawn, and millions of lives had been lost. Yet beyond the political and territorial consequences, the war left behind a deeper transformation, a new understanding of what modern conflict had become. At the center of this transformation stood the machine gun. During the war, armies learned through catastrophic trial and error that industrialized killing could no longer be resisted by courage alone. The machine gun had stripped the battlefield of its illusions. It exposed the limits of human endurance when faced with mechanical efficiency, and it forced military thinkers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Future wars would be fought not by heroes, but by systems. In the years that followed, this lesson reshaped military doctrine across the world. Officers returning from the trenches carried with them a new respect for firepower and coordination. Training manuals were emphasis shifted from massed infantry charges to combined arms operations. Movement would now be supported by suppressive fire, artillery coordination, and mechanized protection. The machine gun was no longer just a defensive weapon. It became an integral component of every unit, embedded into the structure of modern armies. By the time the Second World War began, the presence of machine guns on the battlefield was no longer shocking. They were expected. Infantry squads were built around them. Vehicles mounted them as standard equipment. Aircraft carried them as primary armament. What had once been a revolutionary invention had become routine, a normalized instrument of war. Yet normalization did not mean reduced impact. In the streets of Stalingrad, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the jungles of the Pacific, machine guns continued to dominate space and movement. They controlled corridors, denied advances, and dictated tactics. Soldiers planned their every step around where machine gun fire might come from. Having tanks, aircraft, and artillery grew more powerful. The basic logic of the battlefield remained unchanged. Exposure meant vulnerability. Movement invited fire. Cover meant survival. The machine gun had permanently altered how soldiers experienced war, but its influence extended beyond tactics and technology. It reshaped how societies understood violence itself. Before the 20th century, war was often described in personal terms. Battles won through bravery, honor, and leadership. After the machine gun, war became abstract. Casualties were counted in thousands. Success was measured by attrition and production capacity. Death became statistical, impersonal, and distant from those who ordered it. This shift created a moral gap that still exists today. Political leaders could now speak of losses in numbers rather than names. Industrial capacity could replace fallen soldiers with new recruits and new weapons. The machine gun made it possible to sustain violence on a scale that earlier generations could scarcely imagine, while emotionally distancing decision-makers from its human cost. For the soldiers who lived through it, the impact was deeply personal. Veterans of the trenches often struggled to articulate what they had experienced. Many described a sense of powerlessness, of being reduced to targets in a landscape controlled by machines. The machine gun symbolized this loss of agency. It was not an enemy you could face or out. It was a presence that forced obedience, caution, and fear. This psychological legacy would echo through future conflicts. In Korea, Vietnam, and countless smaller wars, machine guns continued to enforce control over territory and people. They guarded checkpoints, defended perimeters, and suppressed resistance. Their role was no longer just to kill, but to dominar, to shape behavior through the threat of instant violence. Even in the modern era, with drones, precision-guided weapons, and advanced surveillance, the logic remains the same. Machine guns are still present, still reliable, still devastating at close and medium range, still capable of turning open ground into lethal space. The technology has evolved, but the principle endures. This raises an unsettling question. What does it mean for humanity when killing becomes efficient, repeatable, and industrial? The machine gun did not create violence. War existed long before it, but it removed friction from the act of killing. It shortened the time between decision and consequence. It allowed a small number of people to exert lethal force over many, with minimal personal risk. In doing so, it changed not only how wars are fought, but how they are imagined. Modern conflict is often discussed in terms of strategy, technology, and geopolitics. Yet beneath these abstractions lies a reality shaped by inventions like the machine gun, tools that transform human beings into data points on a battlefield map. Understanding this history matters. It reminds us that technology is never neutral. Every innovation carries values, assumptions, and consequences. The machine gun was built to solve a military problem, but in doing so, it reshaped the relationship between humans and violence. It forced societies to confront the cost of efficiency when applied to destruction. The story of the machine gun is not just a story about weapons. It is a story about choices, about how humans respond to power, fear, and progress. It challenges us to question whether technological advancement inevitably leads to moral advancement, or whether the two can drift dangerously apart. More than a century after it first appeared on the battlefield, the machine gun remains a symbol of industrialized war, a symbol of lost illusions, and a reminder that when machines are built to kill men, the consequences reach far beyond the battlefield. History does not judge technology by its design alone, but by how it is used. The machine gun taught the world a brutal lesson, one written not in theory, but in blood, and that lesson continues to echo wherever wars are still fought today.